Try and keep it interesting. This is something to be hopeful for. This is progress that has been made and is being made right now in Washington and in many of the states around the country. So I'm here today to talk to you about the Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act. This is H.R. 3671. It's the first of its kind piece of legislation in that it is a climate justice piece of legislation. So what do I mean when I say climate justice? Anybody? Climate justice is participatory. Who's got an idea? I'm going to wait until somebody comes up with an answer. Bernice.
Well, it means that in poor communities they suffer the most, whether it's poor in developed country or whether it's poor in Houston or whether it's poor in and basically it means that it's not the punishment for climate problems is not divided equally.
Yes. Bernice said it best. So if you live in a community where your congressperson lives or where the donors to your congressperson's campaign lives, you probably don't suffer the ramifications of pollution. If you live in low-income communities, that's where we see those problems. And part of this process of getting off fossil fuels is going to generate a lot of economic development, economic growth, job creation, and we cannot concentrate the benefits of that economic growth and job creation in communities that are already doing well. So justice for who? Well, I said earlier, low-income communities. Communities like mine, like Stillwater, New York, that used to have its own water supply, but because of corporate irresponsibility by General Electric, we had contamination of PCBs in our water supply. And for a generation, we didn't know what we were doing and we were drinking it, including myself. We have justice for Native American communities. I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but Native American reservations are 4% of the land in the United States. They are 25% of the Superfund sites in the United States. These are areas that are designated for cleanup. And that includes 2 Superfund sites on the Akwesasne Reservation right here in the 21st Congressional District. Communities of color. We have a legacy of redlining in this country that has concentrated communities of color into poor communities that are at risk of pollution. Look down at Albany where the bomb trains used to run and look at the folks who are living in those communities. We're talking about justice for those folks. Immigrants. Pretty much the same issue. But also, and this one is tremendously important as we move our way forward into a clean energy future. Justice for fossil fuel workers. Okay, it's not their fault. They're not getting up every morning saying, hey, let's make the world a worse place. Let's threaten the legacy of our human race. No, they're getting up in the morning saying, I got to put food on the table for my family. They're doing a job. So we need justice for fossil fuel workers. So what does that look like? That's all well and good, Pat, to talk about these values. But we have to remember that at the end of the day, this comes down to resources and funding. Apparently, I am losing my connection.
You're okay.
Yeah, I'll just project louder. Anyway, this comes down to funding, right? It comes down to money and resources, and we all know that Congress controls the funding, and the special interest will then control the funding. Well, no. In the All Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act, you don't have to read all of this, but we are putting those organizations and those people that have been adversely affected by climate change and pollution in charge of the spending of the resources associated with this bill. So what are we doing? Well, one thing to remember about the All Fossil Fuels Act. Okay. It's going to be great. So 80% by 2027 and 100% by 2035. So what are we talking about here? Any guesses? Electricity production in the United States. There's a mandate in the All Fossil Fuels Act, and we're front-loading it. So it's not like we're going to get to 2034 and then try and flip a switch. The aim of this goal is to be aggressive and get it done as soon as humanly possible. But not just electricity produced, zero-emission vehicles in the United States of America. These are mandates that are included in this bill. There's an immediate moratorium on all new fossil fuel projects. That means things like the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access pipeline, any new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, those permits will not be granted provided that Congress has the authority. This is a point in time where I should mention that there are 50 companion bills to the All Fossil Fuels Act that through the work of Food and Water Watch and the rest of their coalition partners are aiming to be introduced in every state in the United States. The end of fossil fuel exports. Low-income community weatherization grants. So this is how we move towards energy efficiency, and we're going to concentrate in a lot of areas like northern New York State, areas of Vermont where we have low-income communities. Functionally, the extension of the LIHEAP program and furtherance of that sort of effort. Permanent extension of the wind and solar tax credits. So there's always a sunset clause every time they renew them. In this bill, we make them permanent. And clean energy workforce development. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. A just transition for workers. This is a concept that we need to have. We need to repeat it over and over again. So we don't repeat political mistakes of saying we're going to put a whole lot of coal workers out of work. We're not. We're going to put a whole lot of coal workers into jobs that don't give them black lung. So we're going to prioritize maximizing employment opportunities for fossil fuel workers displaced by the transition to renewable energy and in areas identified as environmental justice communities. And there's direct investments into West Virginia and the rest of coal country here. If 35 more workers in your county become eligible for this worker training program, there are resources that can be invested directly into that community so that we can restore the damage that's been done and again, provide justice for those communities. The worker benefits associated with this bill, really important stuff. So 3-year unemployment insurance, health insurance, pension, job training, healthcare, and living expenses for 4 years to help transition folks that were working in coal mining, working in the fossil fuel area into the clean energy jobs. Workers ready to retire, obviously they have that. And of course there are tax credits to be developed to help incentivize the utility companies, the energy production companies, to hire these workers. But, anybody from labor in the house? Union members? All right, we got one. To be eligible for the tax credits, you have to offer your employees card check union membership. So what does this mean? This is actually really important. I'm really excited about this. Typically, if you want to form a union, you file your paperwork and then there's an election. They just actually won an election at Albany Medical Center for the nurses there, which is tremendous progress. The problem with the election procedure is oftentimes it subjects itself to manipulation by the employers, pressure tactics by the employers. What card check union membership says is more than 50% of the workforce sign their check to join a union, they have a union. So this is really important. It's something we should be doing nationwide, but it's also put into the Off Fossil Fuels Act to ensure that workers are being treated fairly. So how do we pay for it? Carbon tax? No. This is like the one chart I'm actually going to put up here. I know that the jury is still out on carbon taxes, but this is at least one from the Food and Water Watch. I know Australia has shown some real promise with their carbon tax, but at least in British Columbia, they haven't seen any serious reduction in overall emissions due to carbon tax. Part of it is the inelasticity of demand associated with fossil fuels. We can drive less, but we can't stop driving. And a lot of times the results of the carbon tax get passed on to consumers. It's regressive. It can ultimately hurt low-income communities. So, and it's also a little bit inefficient, and I'll explain that right now. Right, this is how we typically think about it, right? We've got fossil fuel company profits, and we take the carbon tax out of there to try and put a price on carbon. But it misses a very important part of the equation. And that's the federal government subsidies that are already going in to the fossil fuel companies. These are things like the depletion allowance that costs our government $1 billion a year. Put $1 billion in perspective, the annual budget of the Drug Enforcement Agency is $2 billion. So for the cost of just that subsidy, you could have a new government agency like the one we're talking about here for clean energy workforce development. It's also the deferment of expenses for fossil fuel extraction, domestic production incentives. Ultimately, there's somewhere on the order of $15 to $20 billion, conservatively speaking, in subsidies coming out of the tax coffers every year going directly to fossil fuel companies. So to fund this bill, yeah, we're not going to do that. But we're also not going to do that. And instead, we're going to do this. And there is an additional funding mechanism there that has to deal with taxing offshore profits of domestic corporations. Though I went and looked at it, and the section they're amending was already amended by the recent tax bill. So that's a part of the bill that will actually have to be adjusted in the next Congress. But that's the method of going about paying for these things. So where are we with the bill? Is the question, right? Who thinks it's a good idea? Who thinks that this is something that we should do? Obviously. We need some more hands here. So this bill started off with one original co-sponsor, that's Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii's 2nd District, and 4 co-sponsors. Through the work of Food and Water Watch and communities around the country, it's now up to 33, including majority members of the New York congressional delegation. So you don't have to read all that, it's more for the effect of it. So what's next? Because there's a lot of things that aren't in this bill. I encourage you to go and read it. It's about 43 pages. The sense of Congress and the wherefores of it are really interesting. They even talk about needing to deal with antibiotic resistance. But what this does is it ensures that in the work that we are going to be doing, we are addressing the needs of communities that have been necessarily affected. That is an important first step. It's setting the overall goal of getting off fossil fuels with an aggressive and assertive agenda. But what's missing? Well, we have to undertake the largest public works project in the history of this country as we rebuild our electric grid into a smart bidirectional grid instead of the current grid that we have. It's an economic development issue, it's an environmental issue, it's also a national security issue. Because if you have a grid like we have now with a very limited number of points of failure, those become targets for attacks. So as we distribute the grid, we actually make ourselves a more secure nation in the face of both attacks from abroad or domestically, and also in the face of increased storm activity that we may very well see, or we're going to see. So that needs to be appropriated and that needs to be done. So this bill, I'm not going to tell you is everything that we need it to be, but is the most aggressive, the most assertive, and the most comprehensive piece of climate change and climate justice legislation. I am a candidate for the House of Representatives. Mind you, I would be here anyway. And I have signed a pledge with Food and Water Watch that I will co-sponsor this legislation day one.